Thank you, everybody, for joining. It is much appreciated. I know January can be full of development and improvement and those things. Sometimes, perhaps, too much for some people in a bit of a grim month. So I'm going to promise that this is going to be relatively gentle and reflective, and that hopefully people can, through their own thinking, come up with one or two things that you can change or even just do more thinking about. And as so there won't be any sort of forced participation. And you can certainly relax during this recorded part. Make a note of anything you want to come back to yourself or in the questions part at the end. And as Tamsin said, we'll stop the recording before that. I think I can mostly skip over this out-of-date headshot because Tamsin's done that intro. I would just say, though, that often what I do in coaching is working with people to help them find their own solutions to things like my diary's too busy, I keep saying yes to things, I'm on too many committees, and I do that with lawyers and other professionals. So often my big thing is to help people find their own solutions. Today, I'm going to share some of the solutions I've found together with some of those that my clients have found through various coaching sessions. So some things might work for you. Please don't think you've got to squeeze yourself into the wrong shaped hole. And I would just emphasize as well that I think for this topic, for many topics probably, but for this topic, I think it's certainly one of those things that, speaking for myself, I keep working on. I think it's one of those that's a process rather than a switch. So if it sounds a bit difficult, if it sounds like, well, this is all very well in theory, it gets easier with practice, but it doesn't get an instant fix, I don't think. So I'll be talking about some different ways to think about boundaries, for you to think perhaps about how you see them, think about maintaining them, setting them, making a commitment, and then a little bit about respecting your own and others' boundaries as well, because I think this extends into many other areas. Things like putting your phone down. Do you have tech boundaries that you don't stick to? And could you get better at those? Okay, so there's your reassurance that I won't be suddenly doing straw polls or picking on anybody in a bid to reduce everybody's January stress. And then just an idea to have a quick think about what it means and why it matters to have boundaries, to set them. You might hear people saying they struggle with them. You might hear people saying they are too boundaried. And a good idea is to take some time, as I'm speaking quite slowly, to think about what this means for you, why you booked on, or why you're watching the recording, if that's the case. Because one of the things I think we often do is set them up as something difficult, and that puts us off taking action to improve. Different images, I think, come to mind for different people. There's a tendency, perhaps, also to remember when it's gone wrong rather than when it's gone right. And just as another quick aside, it is a great idea in coaching, personal and professional development generally, to call on past successes, to think about what worked previously and repeat it. You don't have to endlessly reinvent the wheel. But if perhaps through your own self-talk or maybe through ideas you picked up at school or at uni or wherever, maybe if you've decided that the words that come to mind are things like selfishness or rigidity, or that really this is all about just saying no, and that's a bit hideous, then what you might be able to do is reframe the way that you think about those ideas. And what I realized through some coaching is that I did have the idea that these things are rigid, unattractive. I think that wall picture was very much something that resonated with me. And from that point of view, I found even the idea a bit of a challenge. Whereas the idea of a cell, the membrane of a cell, not a prison cell, but the membrane of a cell appealed to me much more. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. If you struggle either now immediately or later after you've heard some more content to get a positive way of looking at boundaries for you, if you struggle to find the reframe that works for you, to use the coaching language, then it might be a good idea to just look around wherever you are now. I'm in my kitchen and I can see a door. I can see a door and a washing machine. I can see skylights that are just about holding off the rain. If you look around, take a walk in nature, possibly not today, you will probably see that there are useful boundaries everywhere. They almost always, not forever, but almost always, I think, serve a purpose. And when I was thinking about the almost always, I thought, I suppose we've all seen those signs listing a boundary which is no ball games or don't walk on the grass or whatever it might be. And I suppose what that made me think was that we'll come at this from different perspectives. Somebody thinks that's a good idea. Somebody thinks that's useful. Other people might have a really very different idea about that. Think that the nature should be much more open, that ball games are a great thing, perhaps even better than computer games, some might think. So when I come on to encourage some clear communication around boundaries, I think it is a really good idea to recognise that people will come at this from a different perspective, that people are not mind readers. You might think, well, of course it's obvious I don't want to work this evening. Of course it's obvious that I want to maintain a professional distance from my client. But it might not be obvious to them unless you have the clarity and perhaps the bravery to state it. So I am, with the assistance of the internet, about to say a little bit more about why the cell idea appeals to me. And it's because of, I suppose, the absence of rigidity and the idea of some flexibility around that. As some of you might have heard me say at the beginning, I am not a scientist, but I am prepared to accept that a cell, and I think we would call it a cell wall on many occasions, but that it's a membrane. It's selective, it's selectively permeable, which are big words for a Thursday lunchtime. So some substances cross, but not others. And the cell membrane lets the certain molecules come in, some of them go out, and it's doing that to have a beneficial, perhaps even life-preserving purpose. Not even going to attempt to really add my own spin to this next one, except to say that I think we'd all be in trouble if our cells didn't do this. So it helps me see boundaries as being valuable, healthy. It's a word that often comes up with boundaries. Not too porous, not too rigid, a positive and a good thing that might need input from me, might need to change as I change or as my circumstances change. but that is still doing that good work. And I come back to that idea, and you might want to come back to a similar idea for you if I'm hesitant about something, if I'm wondering, is this the right thing to do? I might be thinking, is it healthy? Does it move me forward? Is there a mutual benefit? Those kinds of things. Your image might be different. You might prefer to have an image about the countryside or something of that nature. But because that one helps me so much, I am just going to credit the person where I first read it, which was a book, not really a book. I'll come back to that. Nedra Glover, Set Boundaries, Find Peace, A Guide to Reclaiming Yourself. A title which explains why I didn't read the book. Perhaps I'm very allergic to books which are one idea dragged out to a book. So I am going to credit the Blinkist version of that. And that's a digression tip, I'm going to say, that if you want to learn more, if you want to think more and be exposed to more ideas, you don't have to give up all your free time to do so. You can use summary services, and the one I tend to use is Blinkist.com, I think it is. So what all that led me to, which might be an idea which appeals to you, is that if you don't have boundaries, then what you may well be doing is allowing your needs constantly, consistently, most of the time. You can do a bit of a self-assessment, allowing your needs to take second place to somebody else's. And that doesn't sound overly attractive to me. I am fully in favour of being a nice person, but I don't think we do ourselves any favours, or probably even those other people around us, if we constantly let our needs take second place to theirs. And the flip side of that, for the more positive wording, is that having boundaries, both setting them and maintaining them, translates as being able to count on the people in your life, the people you work with, colleagues, clients, leaders, team members. It means you can count on them to treat you in a manner that you're comfortable with. And that sounds like a better way of going through life to me than constantly allowing your needs to take second place to someone else's. Not least because if we follow those things through to their consequences, sometimes what that leads to is instead of taking action in a proactive, calm, and measured way, it leads to a complete blow up and a massive row, or the walking away from a job or a case, when actually what you could have done was secured a better outcome for you and everybody else concerned. So sometimes I suppose what I'm saying is that we have to do some hard stuff, but that it has real benefits. So a question you might want to actually ask yourself, if this is something that doesn't come naturally to you, or if you're feeling a lot of resistance coming up when I'm speaking, is, can I see this instead of self-care? Can I see it as kindness that is likely to avoid a future blow-up or a future conflict? And I suppose what we have to then accept is, if you have reached the decision that you need to be clear about how you want to be treated, about how you propose to work, whatever it might be, then unfortunately it doesn't just happen by magic. So I'll run through these briefly. I don't want to fall into the trap of just reading slides to you, but just in case anybody's You could be listening on a lovely walk. Um, you do have to state these boundaries. And I think also you have to be fair to yourself and everybody else by ensuring that your behavior, your actions are consistent with what you have said. And I'll give you some examples of language shortly. So you have to be clear about what you're saying, identifying a boundary. And here I would say um, you need to be as specific as possible. So if you tell somebody you want to do less work, might come across as a bit of a confronting message, but also is not very specific. So you might want to drill down a little bit and be able to get that to don't want to work past 6 p.m. on weekdays, don't want to work weekends, something that other people can clearly understand so that there is no ambiguity between what you mean and what they are hearing. Then you do, I think, have to state it. And here, I think a useful mantra, which is certainly alien to some people I work with, is that clear is kind. When people are finding this difficult or new, there's a tendency to pad what they're saying to make it sound softer or to make it sound kinder. And unfortunately, what that can do, not always, but what it risks is that your message gets lost. And the person thinks, I don't really know what Cath wanted to say there. I think she's probably quite happy in what she's doing. She seems to like the evenings. Because you haven't clearly enough stated what it is that you want to happen, perhaps even what you need to happen. Perhaps you've given a mixed message by stating it relatively clearly and then staying at your desk till 8 p.m. And people are relatively simple creatures and will respond usually more positively to a very clear message. I have also suggested, I'm not firing out calls to create dictatorships here. I recognise that people listening will be in all sorts of work settings. I work for myself, but you may well have an employment contract to adhere to. We probably, almost all of us here today, probably have mortgages to pay, and we need to ensure ongoing relationships if possible. So I'm not suggesting coups or anything too wild. I do think that listening, agreement, collaboration, the deal box, deal with the response, listen to it, consider it. I think that matters. It's not weakness, in case that was crossing your mind. So I think being able to say, this is what I want, but how does it fit with the team's needs, the company's needs, and so on. Ultimately, of course, and it's probably a little beyond the scope of a 1 hour lunchtime webinar, but ultimately you might think, well, I don't want to stay here if that can't be something we can agree. Or I don't want to work these types of cases, I don't want to do this type of project, whatever it might be. But in the initial, let's have this conversation, let's see how we get on. The listening is a stage that I would urge you to include and not to miss. Sometimes I think, particularly in this world of personal and professional development that I keep talking about in perhaps a slightly cynical tone, because I'm cynical about some of it, very passionate about the positive aspects and choosing what works for you. I think there's this idea we've got to be super strong. Whereas actually, being strong enough to state what you want, but being open enough to listen would, in many, many cases, be the more effective strategy. And a lot of what we're thinking about here is being strategic rather than letting things happen to you by accident. So being an agent in respect of your own career, your own well-being, rather than just taking whatever life throws at you, being buffeted by the storms, to use a topical image, and so on. And I think this idea of setting boundaries, stating them, identifying them, having a conversation is a strategic thing to do. It is less likely to land you in trouble, or that blow up idea that I've talked about before, because you're being proactive, strategic, and taking control. The backing up the boundary, restate it if you think it's not being heard, possibly issuing or defining a consequence. That's quite context dependent, I think. There are some areas of life where we perhaps get to ultimata, not sure what that is. But I think firstly, they're mostly a last resort, and secondly, the actions have got to follow. So they do need strategic thinking to go with them. So I thought I would come on through the maintaining the boundaries to talk about some language which you might want to use. Nobody will do this for you. That was very absolute, wasn't it? It's very unlikely somebody will do this for you. There are perhaps some brilliant leaders out there. I can think of a couple of examples where they would say to their team, no, I insist you go home. Or no, this project is likely to be traumatic for you. Would you agree if we allocated it to somebody else? It's possible, it happens. I'm prepared to take quite a positive, open view on that, but I wouldn't make that assumption. I would suggest that in the vast majority of cases, the onus is likely to be on you if you think that person, those people to whom you have stated your boundary, are not respecting it, particularly when they have agreed to do so, then it will be for you to restate it. And you will, I think, benefit from doing that calmly. Thinking about what you want to say, first of all, if possible, and trying to have some certainty, clarity around the way forward from that. Which does take me to some language examples. And again, second confession, if Blinkist is going to be seen as a confession, that what I did for this quite deliberately is chuck this into ChatGPT. Can you give me some examples of stating and maintaining boundaries? I wanted to show you, firstly, that help is out there, but your language will probably be best because you're probably brighter than the machine. But it might give you a starting point. And also to show you, these are, tiny sentences really, but potentially with big impact. So we're not talking about padding them. And in particular, just wanted to say a couple of things here, which I do have mixed views on, if I'm honest. But anybody interested in this topic might have come across, or indeed the topic of language, might have come across various articles and things which say, don't say sorry, don't say just, could you just think about this? Don't minimize your message with the language that you use. Um, those are things that I can certainly see the logic in. And I think there is a benefit in thinking about how you speak and the messages, the more subtle, subliminal messages that you are giving to other people. Where I have slightly mixed views on it is I think getting tied up on an or a just coming out of your mouth is probably, it would be a real shame if that held you up from taking the action or having the conversation. Sometimes what holds people back is that they've got to have a perfect pitch for this. They've got to have the perfect, confident words that tick every box of every article I've ever read. And then I think the classic phrase is that that perfection gets in the way of progress, doesn't it? So see what works for you. It's a good idea to pick up if you do have verbal tics. Making things a question, which really are a statement, might be one of them. Using that just or that sorry or only if it suits you or if that's okay with you. And again, I think sometimes that's just perfectly normal politeness. But if you're throwing it into pad or to couch, or because you're not feeling confident about your message, that's when I would suggest that you perhaps think again about that. Okay. Put some examples in as well about digital boundaries, partly to test the AI, but I thought it'd be interesting to see what it came up with. And the you can see there, we might pick apart, we might criticize some of that language, but it might give us a starting point depending on what it is that I want to get from this conversation, and in particular on what the boundary I want to set is. Just leave that one up for a second longer in case anybody that's ringing an uncomfortable bell with anybody. I'm very happy to be from the generation where in most groups I go out with, people don't even take a single picture, let alone share it. But I know not everybody will be in the same boat. Okay, and then a few distinct ideas now. This is a traffic light type system, which I know comes up in all sorts of areas, consent and so on as well. But I thought it would be useful to give you some time to think about the idea about boundaries when the issue arises spontaneously. So far, those tips and strategies have worked towards the idea that you're thinking about something, you want something to change, you have time to plan. Whereas sometimes what happens is somebody behaves incredibly inappropriately at a drinks event. I keep waiting, as somebody who did practice as a barrister through the noughties, I do keep waiting for that Me Too movement to arrive. But I think things are better now, but things do happen suddenly, or suddenly a request is thrown at you to join a committee, to become a fundraiser, to take on extra tasks in what is probably already a very busy diary. And I think just having this idea in mind, which I'll just expand upon a little bit, perhaps helps you, if nothing else, simply have the language and the imagery to send yourself the message that you still have the right to be heard, to be comfortable, and to assert your own boundaries. You don't have to tolerate behavior you're not comfortable with. And this is from the Book of Boundaries, by Melissa Urban. Um, Again, a lovely subtitle there. Set the limits that will set you free. And what this is saying really is that if somebody's saying something which is just about starting to make you feel a bit uncomfortable, a green level, then you might want to say something sooner rather than later. And it's that idea of nobody else doing this work for you. The person who's made the request or has started in on a discussion that makes you uncomfortable or use of language that makes you uncomfortable might be oblivious. Probably shouldn't be, but might be. So you can state that that is a conversation you don't want to continue. Or perhaps your green approach is to change the subject. For some people, again, mixed views on it, I quite like it. The green response might be humour. Diffuse the situation. See if you can get to a more positive discussion. Whereas as you get into amber, what you might be having to do to protect yourself, to be in situations which you find comfortable and acceptable, is to state your position more clearly. And one of the examples that's given is this idea, which is probably quite current at the moment, is the idea of somebody sort of pushing drink on you at an event if you are not drinking for your own reasons, which may or may not relate to January. And it's thinking about how you diffuse that by stating very clearly, I'm not drinking this evening. Don't think that's really anybody else's business. Shall we perhaps speak about something else? Whereas if you get to the red, if they keep pushing and pushing, we might think of it perhaps as not taking the hint. If that is the case, then you choose what your response at the red level might be, within the limits of the law, of course. And I think for most people, what we'd be thinking about is taking your leave. Perhaps if we're talking about that conversation at a networking event, perhaps in the work setting, again, I don't think this is a sign of weakness, but perhaps what you could do at that point, when 5 new projects have been thrown at you with 10 minutes notice, is to say, and I'll come on to this in a bit more detail shortly, is to say, I don't have the capacity for that. Or to say, if that feels too much for you at that point, I'm going to have to go away and think about this. Could we have a conversation about these projects tomorrow, end of the week, whatever it might be? Then make sure you do that, but don't feel, in most situations, you shouldn't have to feel that an immediate, articulate, perfect, scripted response is needed from you if you're strong enough to say, I need time to think about that. That's your boundary. Can we discuss it on such and such a date? Okay. I am, if nothing else, a realist. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, that's not going to work, they're just going to fire it at me. And there will be situations in any business where there's something urgent that needs to be done. Realist, pragmatist, whatever you want to call me on that. But then I think perhaps the message for you from this is you need to talk, maybe you need to do that. But then maybe when the urgency or the emergency has passed, you need to take the time to have a planned, quiet conversation about that. Perhaps something to think about. And I did say that I would address specifically what you can do if this sounds a bit difficult, if it's a lifelong tendency of yours to please people, to say yes, and so on. I think the first thing to do is to really dig down, that expression again, really dig down into what it is that's getting in the way. Is it shyness? Is it confidence? Is it the thinking on your feet, perhaps? Is it fear of confrontation? Because once you've identified what's getting in the way, you're much more likely to be able to come up with a practical solution that works for you and the stage that you're at. I do think for any people pleasers in the room, which does include me, process, not a switch, then remember that you are also a person and you merit some consideration. And I suppose what I'm saying there is if you're the kind of mind reader that is always thinking, oh, if I say this, they're going to think this, they're going to think I'm a time waster, they're going to think I'm a shirker, they're going to think I'm not a team player. A good thing to ask yourself is, what would I think if somebody said that? You will almost certainly have a real life situation to call back on. And what you might find is that actually what you thought was, oh, well done them. Well, that was great that they did that. So be very wary of holding yourself to a standard that you don't hold others to. And if you start to identify that's what's happening, you can then bit by bit start to change that little voice in the head, which is keeping you in that position. And that can tie very much with the idea of prep. I work a lot with people around communication as well as this kind of topic. And I often work with people who say, oh, that guy over there, he's just brilliant at this. Just does it so naturally. Somebody said this to me about their boss once. And I took a bit of a gamble and I said, I bet you if you spoke to them, you would find that they're doing more prep than you could imagine. And I didn't know if they were or not, but they were, or at least they gave the answer I hope they give, which is this isn't effortless for most people. You do sometimes have to put work into it. So perhaps what you need to do is think about the toolkit that you have for these conversations when they crop up, for being perhaps a little bit more prepared to say no. And that's one of the topics I'm going to come to. I am keeping an eye on the clock, by the way, if anybody's panicking. I'm going to try and finish at about 20 past, so there's time for questions. So perhaps you can work on some phrases, that idea of I need to think about this. Can we pick that conversation up again? Not a weakness, a strength. Remind yourself of the positives, think about that imagery, and do pay attention to the successes. I am a big fan of reflection, as you've probably gathered from the outset. But when I work with people on reflection, and when I do it myself, I do have to remind myself to include the good stuff as well as oh, I better do that differently next time. So if you're in the habit of asking yourself, what went wrong? What could I do differently next time? Why not add in what went well? What should I do more of? Or another little reflection practice you could adopt is the idea of stop, start, continue. What features of how I'm conducting myself in this team say, do I want to stop? What do I want to start and do differently? But what do I want to continue will remind you that you are probably doing lots of things very well. Okay. Saying no. So my initial image, so I think I said when I was talking about the wall, my initial image was that boundaries are all about saying no. You have to be that kind of person that says no. And I'm not that kind of person. I'm helpful to collaborate. So hopefully we are now thinking, perhaps, it's not just about that, it's about how I want to be treated, it's about the life I want to create. But I think in some scenarios, particularly getting to a point where your diary looks how you want your diary to look, a thing to work on might be saying no. And if I had a fiver for every client that says to me, I just say yes, I just really wish I could be better at saying no, then I'd be doing all right, I think. I wouldn't be retiring, but I'd be doing okay. So, why is there a cheetah on the screen? Um, I wanted to introduce you the idea of a cheetah pause, if you haven't come across it before, which is an idea in the world of decision making, the theories of decision making. It comes from Cheryl Strauss Einhorn, which I think I'm saying correctly. And the idea is cheetahs, fastest mammals, fastest creatures, don't know, very, very fast. Can go 60 miles an hour, usually go about 30 to 40 because going at full pace presumably wouldn't serve them. Just as you going full pace through life, saying yes to everything, probably wouldn't serve you. But the real key about cheetahs, apparently, according to Cheryl, and I do like this one, is that what really makes them such great predators is not that bit where they're going at 60 or that bit where they're going at 40. It's their ability to pause and pivot really quickly. You can do it less quickly. Pause and pivot to go in a different direction. So the idea here, as I think it applies to boundaries, is that if you are going to find it too difficult overnight in January 2025 to start saying no, if that would be changing the habit of a lifetime for you, then what I would invite you to do is accept the challenge to pause before you say yes. And it could be literally a pause and a breath. It could be that idea of, I want to pick this conversation up again tomorrow, please. I'd like to sleep on that. And again, things like, I'd like to sleep on that. I'd love to help, but I'd really need to check my diary. Those sorts of stock phrases which you can create and pack into your toolkit will replace in time that yes that leaps out before you've had a chance to think. So if you don't like my wall or my cell, maybe you want to see yourself as a cheetah moving forward so that your decisions to say yes, to take action are conscious and they fit with your aims for this year, they fit with your values. I did want to suggest that honouring other people's boundaries is also important. And this is the idea, I suppose, that if you're saying yes to lots of stuff and then you don't do it, you are probably setting yourself up for a rift or a conflict. So it's the honesty, clarity, best policy point, really. But a question to ask yourself might be, if I'm struggling with this, maybe they're finding it difficult, maybe I'm not helping. What is it I could do to perhaps ensure we as a team work better together or that I work better with my clients, whichever of those things it is that you're aiming for. I think like listening, I think if I was going to rule the world, one of the things I would do is make people better listeners, but I would also encourage everybody to respect other people's boundaries, but also to respect your own. Just that I would throw this in for anybody it might help at this stage. How are you getting on with all the things you have told yourself you want to be in your week? You've told yourself you want to do. Do they need restating? Do you need to check that your actions meet your words? Do you need to think about the positive consequences of sticking to those boundaries? So, in other words, can you apply the same strategy that we've been discussing so far with those boundaries, those external things, to the deals you make with yourself? And I knew I wouldn't have time to talk too much about time blocking and thinking time, but I do think that again in reframing how we think about boundaries, thinking about time blocking, limiting yourself so that Parkinson's law is the one that says any task you are doing will expand to give it will expand to fill the time you give it. So an idea, particularly for any busy professionals in the room today, which is probably all of us, is to give yourself less time. It's quite a brave thing to do. Less time to do those tasks so you free up more time in your diary. Very simple example being, I've got to do a proposal. This is a very real example. I've got to do a proposal. I know that probably with proper work on it, it'll take me about 2 hours. If I start it when we come off this call, it will probably fill the afternoon. But if I start it at 3, I'll get it done by 5 and I'll have given myself a little bit of time back to do something useful with. So think about, I suppose what we're saying there is the boundaries in your day, how you treat your work, and if you are working in a way which serves you, or if you're a bit of a slave to the tasks that you've got going. So I will finish with an invitation for you to jot down any actions you want to take, what your priorities might be, and if you want to set yourself a real commitment to act, maybe to give yourself a deadline, maybe to think about an accountability buddy for that, or to give yourself a slot in the diary to check how you are doing. I will wish you luck with them. I quite often on these webinars, and I see no reason that this should be any different, but if people are sitting there in reflective mode, want a bit more time to think, want to ask some questions, always happy to have a quick sort of 15-20 minute call. If you email me and say you were on here, very happy to do that. And otherwise, I will leave that on for 5 seconds more and pass back to Tamsin.